What would you do if an ATM gave you money that wasn't yours? Would you take $20? $100? What about $1,000? Now here's the real question. If that ATM kept giving you money night after night with no overdraft warnings, no declined transactions, no consequences, would you stop? Or would you keep going? In 2011, an Australian bartender asked himself these same questions. His answer cost him everything, but it exposed something far more valuable, a fundamental flaw in how our banking systems operate. Today, we're examining one of the most fascinating cases of financial fraud in modern history, not for entertainment, but for education. Because this case teaches us something critical about system design, human psychology, and why trust, once exploited, can never be fully restored. My name is Instructor Name, and today's lecture focuses on a real-world case study that intersects technology, banking security, financial crime, and behavioral economics. We'll be analyzing the Dan Saunders case, a 30-year-old bartender from Wangaratta, Victoria, who discovered and exploited a critical flaw in Australia's ATM network between 2011 and 2012. Here's what we'll cover in today's session. First, we'll examine the technical vulnerability he discovered, specifically how ATM systems process transactions and where the gap in real-time verification existed. Second, we'll analyze the escalation pattern, how a small test evolved into systematic exploitation, totaling $1.6 million over 4.5 months. Third, we'll study the detection and investigation process, how banks identify anomalies, conduct forensic audits, and build prosecution cases. Fourth, we'll review the legal consequences, sentencing, and long-term financial implications for the perpetrator. Finally, we'll extract actionable lessons about system design, fraud prevention, and why technological vulnerabilities, however temporary, can create permanent consequences. This isn't a story. This is a documented case with court records, bank statements, surveillance footage, and a convicted defendant. Every fact you'll hear today is verified and serves a specific educational purpose. Let's begin. The technical vulnerability. To understand what Dan Saunders discovered, you first need to understand how ATM networks functioned in 2011. When you withdraw cash from an ATM, several things happen in sequence. You insert your card, the machine reads your account information, you request an amount, the machine contacts the bank's server to verify your balance. If sufficient funds exist, the transaction is approved, and cash is dispensed. That's the theory. In practice, there's a critical timing component. Banks process millions of transactions daily. To manage this load efficiently, they employ batch processing. Transactions are logged immediately but verified during scheduled reconciliation cycles, typically overnight between 1 AM and 6 AM. Here's where the vulnerability existed. During this reconciliation window, the ATM network in Australia operated on what's called optimistic processing. The system assumed transactions were valid and dispensed cash immediately, then verified account balances later during the batch process. For standard savings accounts, this wasn't exploitable. The system checked available balance before dispensing. But credit accounts operated differently. Credit cards have spending limits, in this case, $4,500. The system was programmed to check if a withdrawal would exceed that limit. But here's the flaw, it only checked during the reconciliation cycle, not in real time. So if you withdrew money from your credit account between 1 o'clock and 3 AM, the ATM would dispense cash immediately, log the transaction, and only verify it against your credit limit hours later during batch processing. By that time, you could visit another ATM and repeat the process. The system couldn't claw back cash that had already been physically dispensed. The money existed in a verification limbo, withdrawn but not yet reconciled, spent but not yet flagged. This wasn't hacking, no passwords were stolen, no encryption was broken. This was a logic flaw in the system architecture itself. Dan Saunders discovered this vulnerability by accident on May 5, 2011 at approximately 1:17 AM outside a National Australia Bank branch in Wangaratta. Pattern of exploitation. Let's examine how the exploitation escalated, because this pattern is critical for understanding fraud behavior. Initial test phase, week 1, mess 2, Dan's first withdrawal was $60. He noticed the system didn't decline the transaction despite insufficient funds. He tested again 2 nights later, $50, then $100. Each time, the ATM dispensed cash without overdraft warnings. This is what criminologists call testing the boundaries. He was establishing whether the vulnerability was consistent or a one-time error. Escalation phase, month 1 -2. Once he confirmed the pattern was repeatable, withdrawal amounts increased. $200, $500, $1,000. He developed a routine, visiting multiple ATMs in sequence during the 1 o'clock to 3 a.m. window, withdrawing maximum amounts from each. During this phase, his spending remained relatively modest: rent, car repairs, restaurant meals, items that wouldn't trigger suspicion. Acceleration phase, month 3, medius 4. This is where behavioral economics becomes relevant. As the perceived free money continued flowing without consequences, his risk assessment changed. Psychologically, he began viewing the money as his earned through cleverness rather than stolen through exploitation. Withdrawal amounts jumped to several $1,000s per night. He began spending on luxury items, international flights, 5-star hotels in Bali, Hong Kong, and Los Angeles, bottle service at nightclubs, designer clothing. The total expenditure during these 2 months exceeded $1 million. Final phase, month 4.5. By this point, Dan was withdrawing maximum amounts nightly from up to 8 different ATMs in a single session. He had established a circuit, a planned route hitting multiple machines in sequence. His lifestyle had completely transformed. He told friends he'd received an inheritance. He flew first class. He stayed in presidential suites. He lived like someone with legitimate wealth. But here's what he didn't realize. Every single transaction was being logged, timestamped, geotagged, cataloged in bank databases that were designed specifically to detect anomalous patterns. And the system was noticing detection and investigation. Let's shift perspective now to the institutional response, because this demonstrates how modern fraud detection actually works. Banks employ sophisticated anomaly detection algorithms that run continuously on transaction data. These systems flag patterns that deviate from normal behavior, unusual withdrawal amounts, frequency, timing, or location. Dan's account triggered multiple red flags simultaneously. Flag 1, volume anomaly. His credit account showed withdrawals totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars against a $4,500 limit. The system couldn't reconcile this mathematically. Flag 2, temporal pattern. 98% of his withdrawals occurred between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock a.m., a statistically improbable pattern that indicated deliberate exploitation of a specific time window. Flag 3, geographic clustering. He visited the same 8 ATMs in sequence, creating a predictable circuit that indicated systematic rather than random behavior. Flag 4, account history. Prior to May 2011, his account showed typical low-income activity, small deposits, rent payments, grocery purchases. The sudden spike in withdrawals represented a dramatic behavioral shift. When these flags converged, the case was escalated to the bank's fraud investigation unit. Investigators pulled 3 critical datasets. First, transaction logs. Every withdrawal timestamped to the second, with exact amounts and ATM locations. Second, surveillance footage. Every ATM transaction is recorded on camera. They compiled hundreds of clips showing Dan's face clearly visible, withdrawing cash at the flagged times and locations. Third, account reconciliation reports. They traced the money flow, identifying exactly how much had been withdrawn versus how much actually existed in his account. The discrepancy was stark: $1.6 million withdrawn against a $4,500 credit limit. The investigation took approximately 6 weeks. By July 2011, they had assembled a comprehensive case file, including video evidence, transaction records, and forensic analysis of the ATM network vulnerability. On July 29, 2011, the case was referred to Victoria Police for criminal prosecution. Legal process and consequences. Let's examine the legal framework and why this case resulted in criminal conviction. In Australian law, this falls under Section 134.2 of the Criminal Code Act 1995, obtaining financial advantage by deception. The prosecution had to prove 3 elements. Element 1, deception. Dan knowingly exploited a system flaw to obtain money he wasn't entitled to. The evidence, repeated withdrawals during the specific vulnerability window, demonstrating awareness of the exploit. Element 2, intent. He deliberately continued the behavior over 4 months despite knowing he was accessing money beyond his account balance. The evidence, systematic pattern, circuit of ATMs, escalating amounts. Element 3, financial advantage. He obtained and spent $1.6 million that didn't belong to him. The evidence, transaction logs, spending receipts, travel records, luxury purchases. His defense argued that he didn't hack the system, that he simply used it as presented. This argument failed. Australian courts ruled that knowingly exploiting a technical vulnerability constitutes fraud regardless of the method. The trial concluded in March 2014. Dan pleaded guilty to fraud charges. Sentencing: 12 months imprisonment. Court ordered restitution of $1.6 million plus interest. Permanent criminal record. 10-year credit ban. Ongoing wage garnishment to repay the debt. Financial reality: Dan left prison in 2015 with zero assets and a debt exceeding $2 million when interest was calculated. The bank placed liens on any future earnings. His wages are garnished indefinitely. At his current income level, financial analysts estimate he will never fully repay the debt in his lifetime. The money he spent during those 4 months created a permanent financial burden. System response and prevention. Now let's examine how the banking system responded to prevent future exploitation. Within 3 weeks of Dan's arrest, the National Australia Bank implemented the following technical corrections. Fix 1. Real-time verification credit account withdrawals now trigger immediate balance checks regardless of time of day. The batch processing delay was eliminated. Fix 2. Transaction limits. Automated limits were imposed on the number of ATM withdrawals allowed within a 24-hour period, specifically during overnight hours. Fix 3. Enhanced monitoring machine learning algorithms were upgraded to flag multiple withdrawals from the same account within short time windows, triggering automatic security holds. Fix 4. Inter-ATM communication. The ATM network was upgraded to communicate transactions across machines in real time, preventing the circuit exploitation method Dan used. These fixes were implemented nationwide within 6 months and shared with other financial institutions through the Australian Banking Association. The vulnerability Dan discovered no longer exists in any modern ATM network in Australia or in most developed nations globally. The glitch was temporary. It was patched, the system adapted, but the consequences for the individual who exploited it remained permanent. Let's summarize the critical lessons from this case study. Lesson 1. System vulnerabilities are real. No system is perfect. Banks, corporations, governments, all operate on technological infrastructure that contains potential flaws. These vulnerabilities exist not because of incompetence, but because of the complexity inherent in large-scale systems. Dan found a legitimate technical gap. The question isn't whether he was clever. He was. The question is whether cleverness justifies exploitation. Lesson 2. Trust-based systems have legal protections. Banking systems operate on trust. The assumption that users will act in good faith. When that trust is violated, the legal system intervenes. Exploiting a vulnerability is legally equivalent to theft, regardless of the technical method used. You cannot claim innocence simply because the door was unlocked. Lesson 3. Detection is inevitable. Modern financial systems generate massive audit trails. Every transaction is logged, timestamped, and retained indefinitely. Patterns emerge. Anomalies get flagged. Investigation is systematic and thorough. Dan believed he was invisible. He was documented from the first withdrawal. Lesson 4. Short-term gain creates long-term loss. He spent $1.6 million over 4 months. He will spend the rest of his life repaying it. The luxury hotels, the champagne, the first-class flights, all temporary. The criminal record, the debt, the damaged reputation, permanent. The mathematics are brutal. 4 months of fantasy in exchange for decades of consequence. Lesson 5. Systems adapt. People don't always. The bank fixed the vulnerability in weeks. Dan's life was permanently altered. Systems can be patched, code can be rewritten, but criminal records don't get deleted. Debt doesn't disappear. Consequences compound. Application to your own life. Whether you're in technology, finance, business, or any other field, you will encounter vulnerabilities. Systems you use will have flaws. Opportunities for exploitation will present themselves. Your character is defined not by whether you notice these vulnerabilities, but by what you choose to do with that knowledge. Do you report it? Fix it? Help strengthen the system? Or do you exploit it for personal gain and risk everything you've built? Dan Saunders made his choice. He exploited the flaw, and he paid a price far exceeding the temporary benefit. The Australian banking system barely noticed his theft financially. $1.6 million is a rounding error in an industry that processes billions daily, but Dan noticed. His family noticed. His future employers noticed. The courts noticed. And now you notice, final thought. Systems trust users to act ethically. That trust is not naivety. It's efficiency. The alternative is a world where every transaction requires multiple verifications, where progress slows to accommodate endless security checks, where suspicion replaces cooperation. When you violate that trust, you're not beating the system, you're degrading it for everyone. Dan discovered a crack, he slipped through, and the crack closed behind him. The lesson isn't that you shouldn't be clever, it's that cleverness without ethics is just a countdown timer to consequences.